Have you ever been working on your scene and just wondering why your materials don't look as good as what you see on the big screen? Well, today we're going to be breaking apart how studios like Disney go about creating their materials and how we can do that process in Blender to help us create better materials. Let's dive in. Now, just a heads up, this video is going to be part history wrestling and part tutorial. They're kind of be intertwined, but let's dive in. Now, let's just get this out of the way first. There are a lot of elements that create these beautiful scenes, some of these large studios, things that involve tons of people, and also a lot of proprietary software. It's also worth noting that Disney has their own render engine, which is called the Hyperion Render Engine, and you can actually learn more about that on their website here. And also one of their other studios, Pixar, uses the RenderMan render engine. And with that engine, you can actually download that and use that in Blender now for free if you'd like to check that out more. But today we're going to be looking at materials first and how they go about creating those materials. So Disney actually released papers at SIGGRAPH in 2012 showing how they had used this new material system on their film Wreck-It Ralph, and it's called PBR-based materials. And a lot of people have heard of PBR materials, but they don't quite understand the nitty-gritty of every element of one. So in this video, we're going to dive into all the nitty-gritty of PBR and how we can better create these types of materials within Blender. Now, what exactly are PBR textures? It stands for physically based rendering workflow, and the different maps and elements that create these material can differ per rendering engine. Cycles will look a little bit different than what Disney is using. However, you can get a lot of similar results. So the way current render engines work, cycles included with path tracing, they trace ray lights, which will give you kind of a realistic interpretation of how light would bounce around a scene. And when paired with physically based rendering materials, what it will do is bounce off of those materials in a seemingly realistic way, trying to mimic a physically based light reaction. Now, you may not know this, but in the early days of 3D, these things did not exist. So a lot of times in early 3D films, when they're trying to create materials or lights, they were actually creating different sets of materials and lighting setups for each scene to try and create a cohesive look across the film. Whereas now, if we use the same material on our character, we can guarantee that it will react accordingly no matter what lighting scenario or scene scenario we put them in. Now we're going to be used what is kind of called an Uber shader, and in Blender that's called the principal BSDF. I believe in Disney theirs is called the BARF DF. And what's great about this node is that it can create a lot of physically based materials with a few map inputs. And we're going to be breaking this apart and how to get realistic results from this shader using the various elements that build it up. So let's kind of dive in. And first off, I want to point out this drop-down menu here, which has GGX and multi-scatter GGX, which is going to talk about kind of how the energy conservation and things like that work. And by changing it from the default GGX to multi-scatter GGX alone will give you more realistic results as it accounts for the kind of multi-scattering in it. However, it will take a bit longer to render. But let's go down through this list and start talking about how we can use this to improve our renders. Now, underneath there, you'll see where it says random walk, and you have various other options. This determines how your subsurface scattering is calculated. Now, most options, you can go ahead and leave it on random walk. However, for thinner curved objects, you're going to want to use random walk fixed radius. Now, if you don't know what subsurface scattering is, it's how light can bounce around inside of an object and then pass through, for example, on your ears, your fingers, your nose, or the wax of a candle. Now, here, what you can do is turn your subsurface value all the way up to 1, and you'll see that we are starting to get that light passing through the outer edges of this object here. Now, where most people make mistakes here is they create a singular map and just turn it on for everything, and then everything ends up having this kind of glowing appearance. But if you plug a map or value in here, everything that is white will render a subsurface and everything that is black will not. Now, I've covered this on the channel before, but you can create maps that target things like your ears and your nose or other thinner parts of your object or character that can allow light to pass through and give you a much more realistic result. Now, you'll notice that you also have the option to adjust the radius for your subsurface scattering, and there is a bit more information in the documentation online for this. This is getting super nitty-gritty and advanced. Most of the time, you can kind of leave these default settings, and it's going to get you admirable results. And then lastly here, you have the subsurface color, which adjusts the base color of the subsurface scattering. Next up, let's dive into metal. So here you can see I have a corroded metal that has been rusted, and some parts are metallic and some are not. And that is controlled by this field here. So if I go ahead and unplug this map, you can see nothing is metallic, or I can crank it up so everything is. But in the real world, most metallic surfaces are not fully metallic. So you can see here, I have a metallic map where everything white is metallic and everything black is not, and then gray is in between. And this is the key to creating a realistic metal surface. Very rarely, unless you have a new piece of kind of polished metal, will everything be entirely metallic on an object. Things like corrosion, grease, dirt, grime can all contribute to lowering that metallic value. And having some gradual degradation in between those values or some kind of minor non-metallic values can actually add a lot of realism to your metallic textures. But that's not all that makes up a metallic texture. I'm going to go ahead and just drag a simpler metal one on here. So here I have a kind of metal worn and tab into there. And you'll notice here that over here we have this specular value. So if we unplug the specular value and turn that up, we can see that it is kind of adjusting the lighting and how it wraps around the edges there. Now, specular reflections control the amount of dielectric specular reflection and kind of how that will wrap around the object. And if that sounds crazy complicated, it's because it kind of is. But luckily in the Blender manual, they have given us this formula here. Now you'll notice here it says it's IOR -1 divided in IOR +1 and kind of all these other numbers here. IOR stands for index of refraction. And the great thing is that most objects online, you can find large lists of the index of refraction. Now, my favorite website to use for finding these refraction values is Pixel and Poly. And if you scroll down here, you can see that they have this huge list of materials here, and they're organized by various categories, making it very easy to look through. Now, you may not find every material on here, and if you can't, it's probably safe to assume that you can leave the specular value and the index of refraction value at the default setting in the Principled BDSF node, and you'll most likely get renderable results. When I was creating this for all of my materials, I needed a quick way to do it. And the way I went about doing it was copying that formula into a little node from the manual. So if I go ahead and tab here into this node, you can see I've already done kind of all of the math where it inputs the index of refraction and then outputs that into the specular and the index of refraction. So let's go ahead and just zoom in here so that you can copy this node. And what this little math node setup will do is allow you to input the index of refraction value from that list that I gave you. And like I said, if it's not on there, just leave them at the default values. And then that will spit that out so that you get a proper specular. And you can see here that with the specular and IOR out, I'm able to plug that into the index of refraction and the specular. Now, if you don't know what the index of refraction is, that can kind of control your Fresnel effect and how things like that interact with the lighting. And that's actually a huge part of what made this initial discovery of physically based rendered materials so realistic. This plays a large role in your materials. That being said, let's go ahead and keep moving down the list and learning more about these other elements. Now, next up, let's go ahead and take at this roughness value. Now, on the roughness value map, if I go ahead and plug this in here, you can see that anything white is purely rough and anything black is not rough. Now, this is going to be in combination with metallic, probably your most important map alongside your normal maps in terms of creating realistic results. If you have a good base color, you have a good roughness, and you have a good normal map, most of your materials are going to look pretty great out of the box. But what you need to do when considering how to add roughness to your objects is making sure that there are variations. So let's take a look at this plastic material that I have here. Here's kind of a plastic worn material. You can see that everywhere that is scratched has a roughness value of 1, meaning that there is no reflectivity there. And then you can see that with the rest of this, we're getting this kind of gradual fall off. Now, what I've seen a lot of people do is they'll go ahead, plug in a plastic material, and they'll turn it down like here so that you get a semi kind of reflective thing. And you see that if I unplug the normal there, that looks like plastic, but it doesn't necessarily look like real plastic. For example, if you're zoomed in on a Toy Story face. So normal can play a role in that. You can see now that is kind of bouncing around the light as well. But let's go ahead and plug the roughness map in here. And you can see that we're getting these kind of micro variations here on the surface. And if I go ahead and click this in so we can see the roughness map, you can see that's because I've introduced noise into the roughness map. And this is a way that you can go about improving a lot of your materials. By adding a little bit of noise into the roughness map with a black and white color, you can end up getting much more realistic materials, as most objects do not have a purely reflective or non-reflective surface in life. This is also something I show in my texturing course, where I have these roughness maps that I plug into the glasses here to kind of create a more realistic glass. By adding roughness on a lot of your materials, you can really amplify the realism and the kind of tactile nature of your materials in your scenes. Now we kind of skipped ahead of some of these, but I want to go back and talk about base color. Now most people think they just plug the base color in and they're good to go, or they can even just go and set a material here. So you want cardboard? Well, let's go ahead and put brown. But you can see how that doesn't look super realistic. Now this is where texture painting really plays a large role. If I go ahead and plug in this, you can see how much more realistic our cardboard looks. But if we go ahead and look at just the diffuse here, we can see that this doesn't look good at all. And why is that? That's because we've painted down strictly the color values. Now, when you plug in your base color, you want to ensure that there is no lighting information in it to get an accurate material. A lot of people make this mistake when texturing. They'll go ahead and they'll paint their character and they'll start painting in shadows and highlights and lighting details. And you don't want to do that. You want your base color to be as flat as possible so that your reflectivity, your normal map, your specular map, your metallic map, they can take over for all of the highlights and shading. This is assuming you're not doing a stylized character and that you're going for a realistic material. Likewise, something I added here, so I go ahead and click here. You can see that it got a bit kind of darker and has a bit more shadows. You can go ahead and introduce ambient occlusion maps, which can help sometimes kind of highlight the crevices, details, or other small work in your diffuse map. But I gave the option in this one to turn the ambient occlusion on or off to ensure that the user could get the look that they were going for. So let's talk about this anisotropic value. So these are kind of unique values for unique situations, but here you can see I've dropped this kind of gold pure material on here. I'm going to go ahead and desaturate that to make this a bit more visible. And you can see I have an HDR plugged into the scene. And if we go ahead and turn off this anisotropic value, you can see that the reflections start to smear. And then we can actually go about rotating the kind of direction that those materials are smeared. Now, this is meant for very specific situations. Things like brushed metals, a great example is the bottom of a pot or a pan. You're not likely to use this super often, but when you do use it, you need to ensure that the metals you're using in your scene, you know whether they kind of have this brushed look or not, because this can actually really help sell realism by ensuring that you get your metal anisotropic values correct. So here you can see I have a fabric material. This is my wool material. And let's go ahead and look at this. So you can see here that we have the sheen value here. Now, the sheen value is intended to be for soft kind of velvet materials. And if I crank this up, you can see how light starts to kind of go across. And if I turn that down, how the light isn't wrapping around as much. See, the sheen value can be very helpful for like velvet and silk materials. And then you can also control the kind of level of the tint below, which will help mix between the white and using base color for your sheen reflection. But this is for specific cases when you're trying to do realistic scenarios. However, I have found that by turning it up just a tiny bit on all of my fabric materials and scenes, it tends to kind of sell the realism of the fabric a bit more in combination with doing something like a fuzz on your material, which I've shown before, can really help kind of sell the realism of that fabric. So highly recommend kind of playing with that value. Even if it's not physically accurate, it tends to kind of sell the effect a bit more. Now, transmission will control the transmissive nature of your object, which means that if you turn this up to 1, you'll get glass, but it won't look like glass with the default settings. And that's because usually your roughness is turned way up and you need to be able to have that kind of turned down to see. Now, this is where index of refraction can play a large role. Usually in transmissive materials, things like water, goo, or glass are all going to have different values. So you can refer back to that list for more realistic things, but there are other things that play a role as well. For one would be your roughness value plays a large role in the realism of your glass. So let's go ahead and plug one of my random roughness maps into here. If I go ahead and plug this map into the roughness, and this is just using the same values as before, you can see that we start to already get a much more kind of natural glass look. You can also add a color ramp here and crush that a bit. And you'll see that we start to only show roughness on certain portions of our glass, thus giving it a more realistic look. Now, the other thing a lot of people don't consider when making their glass is the thickness. So here, you can see that Blender looks at this, if I go ahead, that this is a just simple, thin material. But if we go ahead and add a solidify modifier, and we switch back to this front view here, and we go ahead and we change how thick this glass is, you can see that it is drastically changing how the glass looks. And by adding a little bit of thickness, that we're already getting a much more realistic glass material. And that's because oftentimes glass is never paper thin, right? It's usually, 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, or a full inch thick, or centimeters if you work on the metric system. And we can go ahead here. And the other thing we can do is also turn up our transmission roughness. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to crush this value here. So not quite as much as there. We can get a better view of this. And we can go ahead and change our transmission roughness. And this is great for creating things like frosted glass. And of course, with anything you can plug into the value here. So if I go ahead and plug in there, we can see that we're getting more transmissive roughness there. This is a great way that you can go ahead about creating things like ice crystals, as you can plug things into the roughness value in a kind of generated map, and that will get you a more kind of natural fall off. But that is kind of an overview of how the transmission properties work on this node. Now, lastly, emission is pretty obvious here. If you go ahead and plug in the emission, it is going to emit, and this strength will kick off, and this will also show light in your scene as well. So you can use this as a light. Now, some people are prone to going and using emissive materials as lights in their scene, which it can create realistic results, but also it can be very time consuming in your render as it adds a lot more noise to your scene. Now, somebody who uses emissive materials very well is Ducky in a lot of his sci-fi renders, and he also has a really interesting video breakdown on how to get more realistic emissive materials. So I'm going to link to that in the description below. But in general, materials are rarely emissive, so by adding things like Fresnel effects and kind of crunching them with a color ramp, you can get much more interesting materials. Now, the normal map section here, you need to create a normal map node, and then you will plug a normal map into it, which is usually this kind of purple value. And what these values and colors represent are different directions of lighting. And what that does is kind of tell the render engine that, oh, hey, this surface is actually angling the lighting this way. And thus you can get a lot more lighting information mixed in without adding a ton of geometry. Most of you are probably familiar with normal maps, but what I like to do to show the power of normal maps is this glitter material here. So you can see that we have this kind of sparkly material here. And if I go ahead and tab out of here, you can see that I can adjust this glitter here and kind of the scale of that glitter. And we have a pretty realistic glitter material. Well, the only real thing in this material is the normal map. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that looks. We can see here that if we ping this normal map forward, we've essentially created kind of just a glitter normal map by creating random triangular shaped values and kind of mixing those up so that when they are plugged into this material here, you can see I have the metallic turned up and the specular turned up and the roughness turned down. But essentially that normal map is driving this entire material to look kind of glittery in appearance. So that's kind of the power of normal maps. But of course, it can be used for things like wood, stone, and many other things to add a bunch of micro details into your objects. The other thing worth noticing too is that you need to make sure your normal map node is set to tangent space and you're using an OpenGL normal map. Otherwise, all of your details will end up looking inverted. Now you can go ahead and invert the normal map if you notice things are off, and that can kind of help as well. But you need to be careful also too about cranking your values. So if I tab here into this wooden value, I've seen a common mistake Blender users make, or beginner users, I should say, make, is that they will want to crank the bump value. So they'll go ahead and put in something crazy like 10, but that can actually start to kind of break your lighting and introduce artifacts. So you don't generally want to crank your normal value too far past 1, except for specific circumstances. Now here I have kind of this grungy paint texture, and we're going to use this to show off the clear coat. So what the clear coat does is create an extra white specular layer on top of everything else. And we can also control that roughness here in the same way we would a normal roughness value. And we can also add normal. So this can be incredibly helpful for things like pottery or car paint, where you want to show kind of multiple layers of roughness, or objects that would typically have a clear coat. And you can see how this is kind of adding a coat on everything else so that we can still kind of see our roughness values underneath that clear coat. And then we can change the clear coat roughness there itself as well, and plug more into the normal. So you can use this in specific instances to create more kind of realistic layers of roughness and rendering. Like I said, it's mostly going to be used for things like pottery, cars, maybe glass on specific occasions, and most of the time you're not going to need to use it. Lastly, here let's talk about height maps. So height maps can add actual map variation and affect the geometry. Here you can see this is a bit of a low resolution. I'll show a higher resolution render here as well, but I've turned on adaptive subdivision. And then under your material settings, under the displacement settings down here, you need to make sure that displacement and bump are on. Normally by default, it will be only bump. Otherwise, when you plug in your displacement map, you won't notice any actual displacement. If you have too low of geometry, it's going to look really funky too, which is why you want to make sure that you have that adaptive subdivision set on here, which will only appear if you have your feature set to experimental. So kind of a lot of extra little steps to ensure that this works. But once you get it working, it can add a lot of realism, but also a lot of render time. So the way this works is you go ahead and you plug in a black and white image value here into a displacement node. And then you plug that onto the group output on the displacement output. So this is actually separate from the BSDF node, but it is a large role of kind of realism. So if I go ahead and click here, you can see here that I have the stone map, but I can also show you that here I have my stylized dirt. And if I go ahead and turn that displacement off, you can see how much it's affecting the geometry on top of the normal and the bump map. So displacement maps are incredibly powerful. And with that, we've kind of summarized all the various elements of the BSDF node and some of the elements that they're using in, primary productions to create realistic materials. But there's kind of one more topic I want to cover in regards to all this. So here, I've primarily been showing you just plugging materials in, but it's also very important that you kind of consider the history of your object. So if I go ahead here and show you an object that I have kind of textured that has a lot of age here, this is a stone statue from my short film. And you can see that I am using things, for example, like this feather moss and this mask material here to kind of paint moss in various cracks and edges and other things like that. If I go ahead here, click back out and click through, you can see that the roughness has variations all around, including more roughness within the cracks of the object. If I go ahead to the height map here, you can see likewise, this is introducing height all over. Go back out here to the main material here, and you can see that what we have is a resulting realistic material. So you need to consider aging, things like cracks, crevices, and more. They're going to have more dirt, more grime. That means darker colors in your base color, but they're also going to have higher roughness values. Now, if you want to accomplish all this in Blender semi-automatically, Kaizen actually has an amazing tutorial where he walks through 3 complete setups of how to kind of add some automated material texturing to your objects, which can really help increase realism. Highly recommend checking this tutorial out. As usual, thank you so much for watching. I know this video is a bit longer and a bit slower, but it really is kind of important to understand all of these things from a minute level in order to create a more realistic material. I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And as usual, I'm always grateful for your interactions.